Someone in your life has died. Maybe it was a grandparent, maybe a parent, maybe someone you weren't ready to lose. And what happened next followed a pattern so automatic you barely had to think about it. A funeral was planned. A date was set. People gathered. Words were said. A body was handled. And then slowly, everyone went home. You did all of that without once asking why, because to you, it's just what humans do when someone dies. But here's the thing, that entire system, the funerals, the ceremonies, the graves, all of it had to be invented by someone. And for a long time, scientists assumed it was invented recently. That ancient humans, pre-language, pre-civilization, were too primitive to care about their dead in any meaningful way. That they treated death the way most animals do. They moved on. The evidence we've been finding for the last 60 years says something completely different. And what it says about those people will change how you think about what it means to be human. Let's start with the most uncomfortable question first. Why would ancient humans bother at all? Think about what their lives actually looked like. Small groups of maybe 20 to 50 people moving constantly through dangerous landscapes. Predators, starvation, ice ages. A dead body in that context turns into a problem. It attracts scavengers. It spreads disease. It slows the group down. The rational response is to leave it and move. And yet they didn't. The oldest currently accepted evidence of intentional human burial comes from Khafre Cave in what is now Israel. Roughly 100,000 years ago, a group of early Homo sapiens buried up to 15 of their dead inside that cave. Not just placed there, deliberately arranged. Some were positioned in a fetal posture, curled on their sides. And when archaeologists excavated the site in the 1930s and 1960s, they found something covering the remains that stopped everyone cold. Red ochre. Someone had ground iron-rich stone into a vivid red pigment and painted it onto the dead, which means someone had decided 100,000 years ago that a dead body deserved something. Color, attention, meaning. We don't know what they believed. We have no written language from these people, but we know they didn't just walk away. And here's what makes this even harder to explain. These weren't the only ones. In a cave in Kenya called Panga ya Saidi, archaeologists in 2021 uncovered the skeleton of a child, roughly 2.5 to 3 years old, who died approximately 78,000 years ago. The child was placed in a deliberately dug pit in the fetal position, knees folded to the chest. Geochemical analysis of the soil confirmed the pit was intentional. Someone dug a hole, placed this child inside it, and filled it back in. A toddler. In the middle of the African coast, 78,000 years ago, given a grave. Then there's the discovery that changed the entire timeline of burial itself. In the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team found something very strange. Deliberate burials that appeared to predate ours by at least 100,000 years. And the species that made them wasn't even Homo sapiens. It was Homo naledi, a small-brained relative of ours dated to between 226,000 and 335,000 years ago. The evidence showed grave cuts intentionally dug into the cave floor and bodies placed inside them in a flexed position. This is still debated among researchers. But if confirmed, it means the impulse to honor the dead existed long before our species did. Which raises a question nobody has fully answered. Where does that impulse actually come from? Scientists have a few theories, and none of them are simple. One is purely practical. A decaying body is dangerous. It smells, it draws predators, and even ancient humans would have noticed that people who got too close to rotting remains sometimes got sick. Burial removes the body. Problem solved. But that doesn't explain the ochre. That doesn't explain the fetal position. You don't need to paint a corpse red to keep predators away. Another theory is social. In a group of 20 to 50 people, every individual matters. Losing someone isn't just emotional. It's a threat to the group's survival. The person who died knew things, held relationships, filled roles that now had to be changed. Honoring that person's death might have been a way of recognizing the weight of what the group just lost. A ceremony for the living, not the dead. But the evidence keeps pointing toward something deeper than either of those explanations. Because it wasn't just a burial. They kept going further. In a cave called Shanidar in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq, archaeologists have found more than 10 Neanderthal skeletons buried across different time periods. In 2020, a new skeleton was uncovered there, an adult Neanderthal who died around 70,000 years ago, positioned deliberately on their back. The evidence made clear it was intentional. Someone arranged this body carefully in the earth. For decades, Shanidar was also famous for something even more striking. Clumps of flower pollen were found in the sediment near one of the burials. The original interpretation was that someone had buried a Neanderthal on a bed of wildflowers. It was one of the most emotionally moving finds in the history of paleoarchaeology. The pollen claim has since been challenged by researchers who suggest bees may have deposited it. The debate is still open. But even setting that aside, it's accepted that these Neanderthals were deliberately and repeatedly placed in the ground over thousands of years. That pattern is not accidental. And then, about 34,000 years ago, something happened that leaves no room for debate at all. Outside what is now Vladimir, Russia, near a site called Sunghir, a group of hunter-gatherers buried 3 people in a way that took our breath away when we found it. An adult male was buried on his back, covered so completely in red ochre that the staining survived 34,000 years. Around his skull and across his body were approximately 3,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory. Each bead had been individually shaped and drilled by hand. Researchers estimated that making each bead took about 45 minutes. Just the beads on that one man represented thousands of hours of work. But then archaeologists found the second grave. 2 children, a boy of about 12 and a younger child of around 10, buried head to head in a long, narrow grave. And what was buried with them is almost impossible to absorb. Over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads were sewn onto their clothing, 20 ivory armbands, around 300 pierced fox teeth, 16 ivory spears, including a lance made from a straightened mammoth tusk over 2 meters long, carved artwork, deer antlers, and red ochre covering everything. Just the beads on those 2 children would have taken a small group working full-time an estimated 2 years to produce. 2 years of labor for children who were already dead. These were not rulers or kings. There were no kings yet. These were people in a small band of hunter-gatherers surviving through one of the coldest periods in European history. And they spent the equivalent of years making things to bury with 2 children because those children mattered that much. Because grief was already fully human. Because loss was already something that required a response bigger than silence. So what did that response actually look like? What happened in the hours and days after someone died? We can remake it, not perfectly, but closely, using the archaeological record and what we know about modern hunter-gatherer groups who still practice something close to these traditions. When someone died, the body could not stay where it was for long. In warm climates especially, decomposition begins within hours, so the group acted quickly. The body would be washed, sometimes prepared with pigment. Red ochre appears so consistently in ancient burials across continents that it wasn't decorative. It meant something. Whether it symbolized blood, life, fire, or rebirth, nobody alive today can say for certain. But it was deliberate. Objects were chosen to go with the person. At Kafse and a nearby school cave, one body was found with a wild boar jawbone placed on its chest. At other sites, antlers. At Sunghir, spears and tools that the person may have used in life. The logic, even without language to explain it, seems consistent. You take something of the living person with them, either because they might need it or because you cannot bring yourself to keep it. The body was placed in a specific position. The fetal posture shows up again and again across cultures separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. Some researchers believe it mimicked sleep. Others believe it echoed birth. The person was returning to something, curled the way they arrived. And then the grave was covered. What happened after that? The wailing, the silence, the storytelling around the fire that night, we cannot hear. But we know from studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities that death creates an instant social response. People stay close. They retell the person's life. They grieve loudly and together in a way that grieving alone never quite allows. Because in those groups, your identity was shared. You were not a person in isolation. You were part of the group's story. And when you died, that story had to be retold to absorb the absence. Around 11,000 years ago, something new appeared. Cemeteries, distinct communal spaces used repeatedly to bury the dead. Not just a grave here and there, but places set aside specifically for the people who were gone, marked, returned to, recognized. That shift matters enormously, because a cemetery isn't just about the dead, it's a claim about the living. It says, we will be here long enough to come back. This place belongs to our people. Our dead are bound here, and so are we. Today, you go to a cemetery, and you already understand it. The language of the place is completely natural to you. The rows of markers, the dates, the silence. It feels timeless. It is. The instinct that created your nearest cemetery was already tens of thousands of years old when the first known one was built. Here's the part that's hardest to sit with. For a long time, scientists assumed that burying the dead required religion, required sophisticated language, required the kind of abstract thinking that only fully modern humans possessed. The evidence says otherwise. The impulse came first. Whatever the beliefs that grew around it came later. Before there was a word for death, something in us already knew it required a response. Before there were gods, heaven, or ritual prayers, someone was painting a body with red pigment and carefully placing it in the earth. Not because a tradition told them to, because they felt something they did not yet have the language to name. You still feel it. Every time you lose someone, you find yourself doing things you can't fully explain. The flowers, the gathering, the objects kept, the grave visited years later for no logical reason except that it helps. You are not following a tradition. You are following something older than tradition, something that was already there inside the first humans who ever looked at the body of someone they loved and could not simply walk away. They didn't know what death was. Neither really do we. But we both knew it was too big to ignore.